All right, as they take their seats, your next panel, I was very excited about this. We actually heard some things earlier today that tee this up quite nicely. So the title of this one, as we get it on the screen, can someone hit advance one? Okay, your data or your life. Part of that game I told you about from RSA conference last year was, I think I called it War Games 2027. You had to choose what's more important, the left-hand side of the picture or the right-hand side of the picture. And during a congressional task force for healthcare industry cybersecurity called 405C in 2016 and 2017, I was the only hacker in the 21 of us. And I said at the very first meeting, after Sam incidentally and accidentally hit patient care in Hollywood, California, at Hollywood Presbyterian, with very harrowing patient care impact without malicious intent, I said, I love my privacy. I'd like to be alive to enjoy it. We're not going to focus on HIPAA 2.0. We're going to focus on keeping patients alive. And yet, nearly 10 years later, we still have more incentive to have a corpse of their privacy intact than to keep patients alive. So now that this conference is about Volt Typhoon and adversaries who want data or money, shifting to adversaries who also want disruption or destruction. How do we overcome our muscle memory? And I was inspired by our moderator, Cynthia Kaiser, former FBI. They can do their own intros. She recently testified to a hearing where she was very adamant that these hospital ransoms are not financial crimes. They're loss of life, terrorist, murder, manslaughter crimes. And I said, let's have a conversation about this because good faith people at the FBI, at HHS, in the federal government, our muscle memory and our incentives tell us to do the wrong thing, or at least we have growing competing equities. And I want us to be uncomfortable in this room for the next hour, 50 minutes. Bring your questions, but someone who's not on the panel today, but will be tomorrow, is often when I'm helping hospitals, they call in Mandiant, or they call in CrowdStrike, or they call in an IR firm, and they're instructed to say, in an abundance of caution, when they're ransomed to the hospital, in an abundance of caution and in accordance with industry standard best practices, we've decided to shut down our electronic medical records to contain the breach and protect the utmost privacy of our customers. And what they did is they just took an existing privacy loss that already happened. They've added a self-inflicted denial of service that delays and degrades patient care with potential loss of life from heart, brain, and pulmonary. And if it's down long enough, they've interrupted cash flow enough to maybe financially distressed or even close a small, medium rural hospital. So with that, I wanted us to challenge ourselves, and I love in good spirit that these folks are willing to challenge our muscle memory for at least 50 minutes. Your panel.
Excellent. Well, there we go. I think I know how to do this. Hold on. There we go. Ha. All right. So, I know a lot of folks have been, this is a great intro, by the way, Josh, and I really appreciate that. A lot of the conference today, and I'm sure you've heard about some of the major attacks that have happened in the last year or two that really have shown us just what types of predators we're dealing with. These actors that are conducting these crimes are callous, and they've decided that they know, right? They know that they're endangering people's lives, and they've just decided it's somebody else's problem. So take us back to last February when there was a cyber attack against the University of Mississippi Medical Center. It's the state's only academic medical center, only level 1 trauma center, only children's hospital. And for 9 days, the staff ran some of these most severe trauma cases on pen and paper. They canceled cancer treatment. They canceled many different procedures. They were trying to move certain individuals to other hospitals. But, the people who did this, they contact the hospital afterwards with demands. And in these cases, oftentimes the money, the being able to cause that much pain is because they want to maximize the payout they have at the end. But as I deal with ransomware, and we'll get into some of these intros in a second, but like, as we look at these actors, we aren't just dealing with ransomware actors. We're dealing with China, Russia, Iran, all these countries that if they want to conduct a destructive attack against us, against our way of lives, will likely use certain types of criminal methods along the way. And it's harder and harder to distinguish them. And so I want to walk through not just the biases and blind spots we might have in that response, in that offensive zone of should we consider it terrorism or not, but really walk through also on the technical side, like some of those biases, blind spots, and muscle memory we may have as we approach these threats overall. And I'm joined by a really great panel of folks today. I'm going to go around, introduce everybody, but we have Brian from HHS, we have Andrew from ARPA H, and we also have Adam from Palo Alto. Myself, I'm Cynthia Kaiser. I was FBI, the deputy of FBI Cyber until about a year ago when I transitioned into Halcyon's, which is an anti-ransomware company's leading its ransomware research center. So go around, give a little bit of our credentials, and then get started.
My name is Adam. I am leading the. My name is Adam, and I'm leading the OT threat research at Palo Alto Networks. My team focus on two main missions. The first one, we collect lots of telemetries, and we do analysis to identify the threat landscape that we see in OT industry, and we help inform our client around industry about these threat landscape. And the second mission is thought leadership, where we actually demo what we are seeing to our industry, because we believe seeing is believing, and we build lots of real environment where we bring the industry, or we go to them with real environment to show them this impact, actually to avoid the biases and to show in reality, if you think this is what's happening, if you think this is not a real threat, actually we can show you in reality this is how it can happen.
I'm Andrew Carney. I've spent most of my career as a vulnerability researcher and exploit developer, but for the last 6+ years, I've been focused more on defensive research at DARPA and ARPA H, focused on hospital cybersecurity as well as broader critical infrastructure cybersecurity. Yeah.
Great. And I'm Brian Mazanec. I'm a Deputy Assistant Secretary within the Administration for Strategic Preparedness and Response within HHS. I know a lot of mouthful of government acronyms there. I lead our Center for Preparedness, which includes our Office of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Protection, which is the sector risk management agency for the healthcare and public health critical infrastructure sector. So we have all of those statutory responsibilities to help the sector hopefully prevent and increase their resilience if they experience criminal or other cyber activity. And we'll get into what is criminal and what isn't in this panel. My center also has other responsibilities, including the National Special Pathogen System. So this is a little awkward, but I thought this was a 30-minute panel. Sorry, Josh. And I actually have to run to an Ebola call related to that. So that's my excuse as I peel off the panel halfway through. So I'm sorry, Cynthia.
We'll ask the controversial questions early.
Okay, excellent. I don't want to miss out, but excited to be here today. Thank you.
That's great. Okay, well, so let's kick it off. What's 30 seconds kind of down the line? Name an assumption in your corner of this fight that you have had to unlearn.
So one thing I unlearn is how to ask a question. And this happened one time. I went to someone working water and utility, and I asked the person, this is what could happen in your environment? Do you believe this is going to impact your water and utility? This is what could happen. And he told me, no. It's like, you sure about that? He's like, yeah, I'm sure about it. It's even if this system got hacked, we will be fine. We actually have a manual testing. We will go test the water manually. We know it's polluted, so we can contaminate it. So I'm not worried. So I did learn like a year later that I did ask the wrong question. So I needed to go back a year after, met the same guy, and I asked him this time the right question. I asked him, tell me what a bad day looked like for you. And then he told me, oh, if this system goes down, this what can happen, and this is what will be a nightmare for everyone. So I learned not to ask the wrong question.
Similarly, I think just because you understand the systems involved and maybe even understand the process and use case, do not let those assumptions carry into specifically healthcare, like coming into hospital networks and seeing familiar devices, being told about the say processes that those devices were supporting. All of the associated assumptions I carried with me from more of an enterprise IT background, not helpful. And the ways of working in those environments, there are reasons for them, and it is good to learn those before you start messing with them.
This is a fun question. I'm going to take it in a somewhat of a different, I think, positive direction. One of the assumptions that I think we, in our role in supporting the healthcare sector and focusing especially on cyber threats, have had for a while is that the C-suite and the executives don't get it, and that cybersecurity is an afterthought. It's not. I actually think that that's changed, and I challenged myself and sort of our paradigm as we approach the sector, because we have seen a market shift. It's a good news, bad news story. I think part of that is because of all of the bad things that have happened in healthcare. Certainly the Change Healthcare cyber attack, I think, was a big sea change, but we don't have as much pushback and get really robust support of and good questions about. I mean, they have real challenges and raise within margins in certain rural hospitals, and like there's reasons why the leadership of some healthcare organizations can't maybe lean in as much as we'd like into cybersecurity, but I think people get it more and more outside of the CISO and kind of IT community, which is a good news story, assumption change from my perspective.
I think that's a really interesting point in terms of like how we're interacting and talking with hospitals. And, one thing I've really thought through and had to rethink on the hospitals, like, and how they're targeted is, I assumed, coming from my government lens, right? Any crime you want to have prosecuted, any crime you want to have, but I didn't really think about the other pressures that hospitals are facing, right? The financial pressures, the liability, the concerns. And so in my head, I'm like, well, yeah, of course, like if somebody dies, they're going to want to like pursue this to the maximum extent of the law. There's a lot of other factors that go into their thinking about that. And I've really had to unlearn that as I'm thinking about how do we approach this moving forward? How do we stop it? I want to stay with you, Brian, and talk a little on just the sheer number of attacks that are happening against the healthcare sector. So in 2025, healthcare became the single most targeted sector for ransomware, and attacks on hospitals nearly doubled, at least according to FBI's count, from 238 to 460. That's more than one attack a day. I mean, that's a lot. So I think that old idea that hospitals were off limits is dead. So from your seat, like working with hospitals, coordinating with CISA, FBI, et cetera, what's the assumption inside the healthcare sector itself that's been hardest to shake in terms of how they approach the threat?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I couldn't agree more. I think, in fact, depending on which data set you use, which is all incomplete, right? We're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. We don't know. And there's no mandatory reporting requirement. There's a lot of activity, I think, that we don't even see. So taking that for what it is, I think it's even before 2025, healthcare was consistently in the top 2, and often, depending on which data set you use, was in the top, at the top of the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, particularly for criminal ransomware activity. That's obvious. We touched on it already. For a lot of reasons, healthcare is a diverse, massive ecosystem with so many legacy devices, razor-thin margins that lead to under-resourcing IT and cybersecurity functions. There's a huge incentive to pay. There's a whole ransomware insurance industry. I think everyone here, I'm sure, appreciates and already understands. And again, I think executives also understand why this is important, and the threat is only growing for healthcare. I think the question in terms of what we need to challenge, I think it's still, some people think that because of all of these complicated factors that drive the threat, that the solution isn't necessarily really complicated. I don't think that's true. So many of these ransomware incidents, and by the way, we're tracking just within HHS last year, we tracked over 2,200 cyber incidents that we triaged. Again, some of those didn't necessarily spawn from ransomware, and there's different types of incidents that we're triaging, but it's a huge number. But I think a lot of them go back to fundamentals and basics, and just hammering again and again And we put out healthcare and public health sector cybersecurity performance goals, or CPGs, that are specific to our sector a little over 2 years ago. And again, the really essential 10 highest impacted practices, MFA, I mean, basic stuff. And if we could just get everyone to level up on those, I think we would dramatically increase the resilience of the sector overall. So it is, even though it's a complex picture of the adversary and so many different pathways in, it really ultimately still goes back to basics for so much of the threat. Not all of it, but for so much of it.
Is there a seam between IT response and clinical operations, like as we're approaching some of these incidents?
I mean, there's a human element, certainly. The clinicians and the people involved are big. I mean, I'm sure how many of us haven't been in a doctor's office and seen the little sticky still with all the passwords and things on it. I mean, there's that, if that's your question. I mean, there's definitely that human dimension as well as the technology side. It's all of the above, I think.
So, Adam, I want to turn to you and talk about Palo's recent report on security OT environments. It noted this giant jump, right? Like 300 something, over in unique internet exposed OT devices. So with nearly 20 million now observable on the public internet, and more than 70% of OT attacks starting in IT before they ever reach the OT environment. So, I read that and I think, well, is air gap dead?
Air gap is not air gap, it's not air gap.
Yeah, so the concept of air gap was very, I'm not gonna even try to convince anyone it's dead, because have been hashed out so many times. And in fact, like last week, I was talking with someone who was thinking about, I want to make a presentation or a talk to talk about air gap and why it's dead. And we were in a dinner, and we tried to convince this person. I think if you try to talk about it, nobody gonna listen, because everybody knows air gap is dead. And so we did have that debate that this has been hashed out. But the other way we wanted to talk about it, if you want to be air gapped, how is going to be very difficult to do? And we were talking about a book, I think it's, if I remember the name, The Art of Invisibility, I think that's the name. And the book was talking about, if you want to be out of the grip, right? Like you be completely disconnected and you cannot be tracked. And it's talk about all these steps that you're going to do to be impossible to be tracked from the technology. And we said, okay, let's talk about, if you want to be air gapped, what it's going to take in your environment. You're not going to have remote access. You're not going to have any devices getting batch or updates easily. You're not going to have a loss of credential. All of these things, we were talking about how this is going to be impossible to do in the modern technology now. So all these new devices and all these new technology that's coming out is actually forcing all industries to be connected to other network and to the internet. So asking them not to do that, it's making their life more difficult. So air gap, I won't say it's, I will let people decide if it's impossible, but to do it, it's going to be so many steps and it's very difficult to accomplish. And with evolving of the technology, the solution of air gap is not, in my opinion, is not a feasible solution to lean on. More, what can we do to be more resilient with all this converged technology? We also used to talk about IT and OT converged technology. These are not the only two technologies now are in conversion, right? You have cloud, you have IoT, you have AI, you have 5G. There's so many technologies, those all getting converged now. And talking about air gap with all these technology, I think it's a myth. That's my opinion.
So taking it back to hospitals then, I think one thing striking in your report, it talks about building automation as, right, really? And so I think about hospitals and HVACs and what happens when that goes down? How can this happen?
Yeah. So this was a very interesting point, because when we collected the data, and this is how we did it, we tried to be more creative on how we would look at our threat landscape. We didn't look at the industry first. What we did, we looked at firewalls that see OT traffic. We have App ID that has application, and all these applications are known to be for OT. We identified 1,600 applications known to be used in OT. And any firewall have seen one of those applications, we took that serial number and we tagged this as an OT firewall. We identified over 60,000 firewall that's seen these OT traffic, and then we start to collect telemetries from there. One of the top 10 technologies or application was building management system. And we were like, this is a data skew, there's something wrong in this data, or like where this is coming from. And then we had like 12 analysts or researchers from the three organizations, us, Siemens, and Idaho National Lab, are debating on why is this, should we exclude this or should we keep it, and to make the analysis make sense. And we came up to a conclusion, no, we need to keep it, because building management system, if it got hacked, it's going to impact whatever industry. If you're talking about hospital, the HVAC system is down. Like, it's so many things are going to happen. I'm not a doctor here, so I'm going to let you decide. But not only like the building, like not the HVAC, but also even just closing a door or lock down the system. So there's so many things, like building management system now can be a huge impact. So I'm glad you brought this up, because it is one of the things that I think, talking also about blind spots and biases. When people hear about OT, they think about a BLC or a motor or a generator. Building management system is an OT.
Yeah, and it's everywhere, right? We all have to do it, be in a building. So I'm going to skip around our normal kind of process of operations, because Brian, I really want your opinion on some of the more controversial, or at least your government approved opinions of this, right? So let's put it on the table. So if a contractor knowingly tampered with the medical equipment of critically ill patients to extort a hospital, we wouldn't debate the charge that we're going to give them. We'd prosecute it to the fullest extent of the law. But when someone does something on a computer, somehow we're changing how we approach that, right? We're thinking differently about what we might be charging these individuals and how we might be approaching them from a deterrence perspective. So one thing that I'm really interested in is thinking about, like, all ransomware, let's just go ransomware. All ransomware is crime. But is some of it terrorism? And is some of it murder? How do we parse this? And like, really, their legal hooks exist. So it's more about, right, the legal definition of terrorism applies to what we see. So it's a lot more to me about how we are actually approaching it, whether we're getting the right information from hospitals, whether we want to designate them, whether we want to ask hospitals to flag for us when there might be murder, because then you can charge like ransom actors with murder, et cetera. So I'm going to go to you first, because I really want to get your opinions before you have to get going.
No, this is a great question. And of course, not a lawyer, would defer to the FBI on what is and isn't terrorism. But I mean, I would agree with your general characterization, though, that some subset of criminal ransomware activity probably should also be in that bucket. I think it depends if it's purely, so much of the criminal ransomware activity, and I don't think we have great data on this, but is motivated for financial gain, because that probably isn't terrorism in the proper legal sense of the word. But certainly there's other activity that we see that would, definitely. I mean, so, and from the HHS perspective too, and especially from the ASPR sort of SRMA perspective, when we're responding to an incident, our focus is not on these questions, as interesting as they are. It's patient health and safety, and how do we minimize the impact on Americans' lives and save folks. So to some extent, it doesn't matter for our mission, but to the deterrence question, I think it definitely does. And we're fully aware, although it's not an HHS call to weigh in on, if we are able to designate some of these actors and some of this behavior, the actors as terrorist groups. I mean, I think that unlocks a different tool set that could be really helpful in shifting adversary calculus. So we're definitely interested in supporting the appropriate departments and agencies and exploring this question. But I would go back to what I said earlier too, though. At the end of the day, from a preparedness perspective, so much of what you need to do doesn't matter what the intent or how we categorize it. So always focus on those fundamentals, get the sector to level up its posture. But then, yes, this question, I think this could unlock some real interesting possibilities from a policy perspective.
I'm glad you say that. Because my follow-up question is, what are the problems on the hospital side for doing this, right? I mean, I've heard that, they're worried about insurance and what it does to their insurance, or, if you're talking about felonious murder charges, which I think most people are tracking, but if somebody dies when you're in the commission of a different felony in the US, you can charge them with felonious murder. But people have to take all that data. Like they have to actually keep track of that. They have to report it. They have to tell us. Yeah. So how might hospitals be reacting to this? I don't think it's all open arms.
No, so I don't disagree with anything you just said. I will say, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with any hospital or about whether or not they consider what's happening to them in the course of an incident as terrorism. So I don't think I have a great, well-informed perspective other than speculating, but I think everything you identified, they're already overwhelmed by a variety of burdens. They get third-party counsel that tells them not to necessarily cooperate before they think it's terrorism, and this would only complicate that calculus. So I think everything you said is probably right, but this is not a conversation we're having with hospitals now. Maybe it's when we should be. I might ask this question in the future, but
I have questions I can send to you.
Yes, please. And again, my apologies for having to peel off.
Oh, no. I just want to make sure we got to you. So let's go down the line here. Andrew, we haven't heard from you yet. I'm going to ask the terrorism question, then we'll get into some of the other aspects a little later in the panel.
So I think Brian started to touch on this. I would answer your question with a question, which is, will this actually improve healthcare outcomes for the patients directly impacted by these events, and also practitioners? Will this make things better in the near term or long term or both? Because if it doesn't, I'll invoke 9/11, maybe do that. But reading the 9/11 Commission report and seeing the divergence between where the primary value was in safeguarding sort of air travel, like steel cockpit doors, the way that the staff on the plane would deal with the carts, and the degree to which those mitigated the predictable threats, and the very high value we got from these mitigations versus many other actions taken that did not have zero value but also came with costs. And so I think I do think that these are thoroughly immoral acts, and it is entirely unacceptable, the degree to which a ransomware payout, even if successful for hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, incurs potentially billions of dollars in expenses and an incalculable kind of human loss. There's no excusing that. But from a policy and sort of how would that change things for the hospitals? That should, I think, be the first question we ask. And if we don't have a good answer there, I don't think we should change things.
So would it change the way a group like yours or Brian, yours might fund and mandate resilience, though, if we're talking about stopping acts of terrorism, or if we're talking about patient lives over data, right?
I don't think it would change what we did. It might elicit more funding to support what we're doing in some way. I mean, it definitely could have an effect on the broader conversation with Congress and others, but I think what we're doing, to Andrew's point, we would do it regardless of if it was a state actor or a criminal ransomware group purely interested in money, or a terrorist group that could be a state actor or not. I think at the end of the day, for us, it's about saving Americans' lives and patient health and safety. But to your point, I do think there's an interesting thread to pull here on what sort of the broader deterrence question about if this could really change the ecosystem, because that, I think, is the wicked problem that we haven't yet cracked. All the incentives, this is just a vicious cycle that seems to only be speeding up the wheel. So I'm all for exploring creative ideas to kind of break that cycle. So, but there's probably more threats to pull, which I think you're doing on this question, but definitely interesting.
Yeah, I think there was a paper earlier this year, health economics paper, that actually looked at CMS data and was the first figure I've seen that was very high confidence on sort of the minimum number of directly relatable deaths in the US related to ransomware attacks.
I'm very familiar with that, yes.
And that author, they sort of extrapolated that into about 50 deaths per year is the floor, right? Which is not nothing. To your kind of question framing, if that happened in some other context, we would respond seriously. And so it does really, I think, it's worth investigating more. And also the collaboration, maybe even between law enforcement more broadly and HHS. I think that might open some interesting doors for more collaboration, coming from a a more operational background, they're definitely, leveraging expertise for better defensive effect. I could definitely see potential opportunity there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think as we look at policy goals, like figuring out ways to make sure ransomware doesn't kill people, right? Like that's a worthy policy goal. Then we can like peel back from there and really figure this out. So with that, I'm going to go to you, Adam. If you're looking at this and answering your question on, and thank you very much, Brian, for being here today. If you're looking at the kind of like this idea behind the terrorism, and we want to know that answer from you too, if what your thoughts are, but really then peeling back from your lens at a group like Palo, like if the same intrusion you're looking at, and you don't know attribution at first, right? Like, does that terrorism frame help or hurt when you can't do your approach? Does it matter when you can't really kind of cleanly attribute at the edge?
So this is one of the things when I work with my team, we decided from the beginning to stay away from attribution because we said like threat is a threat regardless who or what's their intent. The impact is what matters to us. And that's what we try to send to the industry and the community. And our first audience are the defender, that a defender will need to defend their organization for these threats, right? And that actually also help us to stay away from biases because we're looking at threats regardless who or where it's coming from. Where we care about is what's the impact can that cause. And one thing we also have a lot of debate about, and we came up to a conclusion that IT threats is an OT impact at the network edge. And that's where there was a lot of concern about that. This malware is IT-centric. Why are you talking about it for OT? Well, if that malware is in the OT network edge, it can and it will at some point impact your OT system. And that's the correlation we made. And that's what, when we went our clients or even industry and we give them that report, one of the things we heard, which was very interesting, they said, can you please send us once you publish it because we want to show our board that report, because that helped the defender to justify their spend and expenses. We always, like this is something I always try to remind myself and the industry, as a cybersecurity professionals, we are cost, we are not revenue. And our justification, because we do risk mitigation, and risk mitigation comes between you multiply the impact by the probability of the incident happen. All organization can tell me the impact. If this system down, this how much money would lose or how much life we could lose, right? Then this question now, what's the probability of this to happen? And this is where our findings comes in to fill the gap in this equation. And with this information, they can go to the board and tell them like, hey, these actual threats happening. And from our data, we have millions of malwares. And this is also something very different. When you look for incidents on the impact level, you are not doing risk mitigation. You are too late in the game. You are activating incident response. And this is also like there was a conversation earlier today, is incident response really matter? By the time you're doing incident response, some of the engineers or they will restart their device. So I'm not talking about incident response. I'm taking you like way steps back that when you actually have time to do mitigation and you actually can stop this from happening. And this is where we said, this is what we are seeing. Here is the data. This is how can you justify your spend on the detection level. You have time to avoid the impact of the incident. So that's where our philosophy. So I hope that helps answer your question.
I think it does. And I mean, I think you're kind of bridging into the next point that I want to explore here, which is one of the areas that we've heard as a criticism of, or maybe not a criticism, but just an output from talking about, is some of this cyber activity, terrorism, is that entities that might welcome that because it absolves them from some of the defensive steps that maybe they needed to take in the first place, which is not what we want, right? Like you need strong offense, you need strong defense. So, Andrew, I want to talk a little more then about the time, that window of time that you have before impact, but where there's actor activity, right? Like, have we built anything that can act in that window?
Yeah, so we have, like, short answer. I think one of the interesting opportunities with the kind of low and slow campaigns like Volt Typhoon is, if you assume that you have an in-place adversary in your system, you haven't entirely lost at that point, because that adversary by design has attempted to be minimally impactful to evade detection. So they haven't necessarily moved laterally. They may have pre-emplaced, some number of effects, but there's still potentially, maybe it's very small, but there is a window to, even if you can't fully root them out, maybe you can react in time if you can detect, like, in a sufficiently fast manner. There's like those super time critical situations like that. And then there's more like, how do we re-architect? How do we think about this if we have an even longer kind of tail window to address? But all of these situations are super context sensitive. And one of the big challenges moving from enterprise systems to hospitals, power plants, any kind of more diverse technology kind of system is that it's really hard to test in. And it's really hard to test in a way that is directly applicable to this specific hospital, this specific water treatment plant. And so, the gold standard when we're talking about enterprise IT, when we're talking about national security kind of relevant systems, weapons systems, national defense systems more broadly, is we have analogs, we have simulators, we have, cycle accurate emulators if you're willing to spend 10,000x the time to test in that environment, so that we can run all these scenarios with extremely high confidence that what we deploy, our tactics, our playbook, is the right set of moves. We don't have that for these more both highly critical and technologically complex environments. We certainly don't have them at the scale or fidelity that we would need to. And so one of the big pushes that we've been both at DARPA and ARPA H is developing technology, some of which is commercially available right now, that can help you create digital twins of individual devices, even potentially entire networks, that can use hardware in the loop in an entirely automated way to test the hypotheses that you might have, test the potential adversary scenarios you see happening to your peers, and give you data so that your response can be evidence-based. And I think there are a lot of different facets, I think, especially in healthcare, where we have an attestation-based, or compliance-based security approach, and we are building the technology to move to a data and evidence-based approach to defending these systems.
I love that. So my company, we funded a research study or just a study that went out to, and questions that went out to CISOs. And I was shocked that what came back is you'd have the vast majority say, yeah, no, if a successful red team will probably get past my networks, right? But then we asked them the same question about adversaries. Just say like, well, could you stop a ransomware attack? They're like, yeah, I think I could. And you're like, that's the same thing, right? And it was very odd for us to look at that. And so, thinking about that, and being able to really test out that and show people like, no, this is the exact same scenario. This is how you do it. It's critical. Are you also involved? I think you're involved in a little bit more of that, just funding overall for the automated patching. Is like, are you able to talk through like DigiHeals or anything like that? Or I think there's some other programs out there that really help prepare, right?
Yeah. We so I think Matt's the CI Fortify discussion, this idea that making the red teaming, like giving you that security assessment, they can, like, CISA can help do that up front, which is great. We wanted to empower like industry from a device and system perspective. So taking the same technologies that we've used to hot patch space probes and weapon systems that are already forward deployed in the field, how do we take that technology and make it cost effective and available for health tech, for folks in power, and also just, once again, validating some of the broad scale, not assumptions, but one of our research efforts involved in just kind of a validation study of the darknet marketplace for credentials to American hospitals. And we were able to actually get super solid numbers on the very few thousands or hundreds of dollars it cost to get confirmed access from that initial access broker. And that, that piece of the pie was, in discussing with our friends at Asper and other kind of HHS folks, like concretizing that was super helpful. But we took basically the same approach that the IC takes when they're looking at national security problems. We hired the same people and we had them use the same methodology to assess that, and including some of our law enforcement friends as well. But we really hammered it. I think really hard, because one of the things we saw when we were looking at forensics from ransomware attacks against hospitals was the push to make the system, the hospital, more available and get it up and running again, basically required a sort of abbreviated forensics process, because the push was we need to get ourselves to a point where we're trustworthy enough to operate, to get patients back in the loop, which meant we couldn't necessarily spend the time we might have wanted otherwise to analyze how the systems were impacted. So just increasing the confidence maybe on the TTPs and then validating that with some other data. That's been part of the work, but it's yeah, I realize that's kind of like we're hitting it from a lot of different angles.
That's what you have to do, though, right? I mean, you have to hit it from a lot of different angles. So I want to kind of dig in a little for both of you here and get into that, like what you were talking about, the response, right? Like how you get back on like line, what you need to do. And a lot of this is institutional muscle memory versus actual factual, right? Like how do you respond? And so what is the advice that you would give hospitals today, both of you, about getting back online? Like what's the key component here they need to really think about that maybe they haven't been thinking about previously?
Okay, so I will go back in my career like 8 years ago when I started work in the SOC.
Okay.
So we actually will do investigation. We will get alert. We investigate if this is a false positive or true positive or true negative. And then we escalate this to the incident response team so that we activate it. One thing I learned during this process is to make sure you avoid your biases in your analysis, right? Sometimes we can make a quick judgment like, oh, this is a false positive because we have been receiving a lots of alert that are false positive. So by just my mind immediately go there and neglect it. When you talk about incident response, we talk also about like tabletop exercises, and people get trained to do incident response in a specific way. I think one of the challenges, or one thing I would question, would we have a muscle memory to activate a specific incident response because this is how we trained on? Are our incident response training actually making us question our biases in the process? Are we even including this in our report? Even when we published our report, I talked to my team, we need a section to talk about our own biases in our analysis. So people become aware that what has impacted our analysis or what we couldn't even avoid. So I think if I would give advice, probably would be during your tabletop exercise, include that section and include how you want to train around it during the incident response when you activate it.
So basically like helping people understand biases, understand what's going on without overreacting. Is that really the key here? Okay.
Yes. And there is actually, even the training, there's different types of biases. There's analysis of biases, or there's human biases, or there's even sometimes expertise biases, like because your boss told you that, so you trust that, oh, they know more than I do, so you listen to them before you question that guidance. So actually there it was a really great training. It did classify different type of biases, and during our investigation, okay, we want to check, did we avoid this, did we avoid this, did we avoid this? So that kind of a checklist could be a really good checklist to have during your response.
Andrew, what's wrong on our checklist?
So cancel all of your anti-phishing training, like any cybersecurity training that you're giving your staff online, cancel that. Spend those hours, spend that funding on literally anything else. I think also kind of to the point earlier, if you do not have a robust response plan, detection isn't that important. So figure out, like, you'll know probably when you've been hit. If that additional hour or day of extra warning, if you can't do anything with it, don't pay for it. Don't use it. Like, and this I think is especially more relevant for smalls, where like the desire to know, the desire to have that intel is reasonable, I think, in the general case. But if you're really dealing with a resource constrained environment, like there might be better ways to optimize that feel a little off, but are in fact the right thing to do, both for your staff and your patients. Hopefully I don't get roasted too hard later for any of this. I will say that one of the most interesting experiences I had coming to healthcare. So I have not been a public person most of my life other than playing CTF at DEF CON. And so coming to ARPA H was the first time my name was ever on a website, like in any professional capacity, really. And I started getting cold called by technology companies that had these healthcare specific cybersecurity solutions. And I was so interested. I was like, great, I get to learn from folks in the industry. And most of the companies, well, all of them were really names I didn't know. The big names that I knew, I was already having reasonable, useful conversations. So I was excited to learn from these other companies, these smalls that may have, have super interesting tools or whatever. So we started to take these cold calls, and I realized very quickly that the sales engineer and the technical SME that was presenting to me, they thought that they were pitching to a doctor, not to someone that had reverse engineered and broken many, many software and hardware systems. So they were making claims that I knew were literally impossible. And then they tell me about their customers and how happy they were with these products. And I was like, friends, you're low-key committing fraud, but please give me your customer lists because we need to chat. And so the low information sounds too pejorative, but like there is space in the spend, I think, in a lot of these places where people are already spending money on tools that provide them little to no value or maybe negative value. And so like moving to more kind of evidence-based and appreciating the large scale studies that some of the industry leaders put out, like those are the data points that help drive us actually kind of like fielding like data-driven solutions. Yeah.
So I remember a time where we responded to a Volt Typhoon incident when I was in the FBI, and we showed up and we identified that they had a really good security program that actually caught it and alerted really early, but no one knew the login and no one was getting the alerts anymore because the person who had bought the system had left. And that's really, really common. It's kind of embarrassing, right? You don't want FBI incident response to show up and say, hey, what's your password, right? Like for these things, but I'm talking about misplaced spending, right? If you're not going to look, right? What else do you do? Let me ask a more pointed question. Should people shut down their systems after an attack? Right? You have to balance kind of like the loss of patient care with, is that the right call when you're in the middle of an attack?
So I think I'm going to dodge this question as hard as I possibly can. So I think Josh's point about I would rather have my data like leaked, like I would rather be alive and enjoy the fact that my data has now been leaked to whoever. I think if we accept that to date, like specific medical devices, like if the Windows machines on your network are borked because of the ransomware attack against you, but you have, even if they're not entirely isolated, but they're not directly impacted, like you can still use, the PAX server, you can still access, it's a really interesting proposition, whereas like there's no obvious problem here. This seems to be working. So is it more valuable to the patient to leverage that imaging system that is on a compromised network but does not appear to be, misbehaving, or do we shut down to try to prevent, further contagion? I think that's a super context sensitive question. But I do think it's a question worth considering and asking, because I think there's a bit of it can be too reflexive to be like, just shut it down so we don't like further kind of to contain the damage, but you are in fact doing damage by making that decision.
I think if you an incident response or you're during an incident and you're asking this question, I think that's too late to ask that question. Yeah. I think that question should be addressed way early, way before all of that, and you can identify your assets and how you're going to treat every asset in these conditions. So when an incident happens, you can rely a little bit on your muscle memory and you have direction that, yes, this is what we're going to do because that's what we trained on. And we assist this when during like, easy time, not everybody's stressed. We brought everybody that need to make that decision, and we took all these input and we were able to make our risk assessment, our incident response plan, and we identified like, okay, these are critical assets. There are under no circumstances should be shut down. Doctor said that, or whoever the stakeholders, and they made that assessment, and we were very clear during doing that. So that would be my recommendation.
Also, actually, so one of the efforts that we funded was once again sort of a data-driven examination of this problem. And so there's a team out of UC San Diego that has a system called Crash Cart that effectively replaces sort of it's a right-sized, minimal but sufficient replacement for the likely impacted infrastructure in a ransomware attack, so that the machines that are very unlikely to have been directly impacted can still be leveraged, but you have that core infrastructure basically in place, like put into place rapidly. Like they can support up to a 50-bed kind of emergency department in under half an hour, like literally like pulling the Pelican cases out of the van, getting the system stood up, and getting it connected with entirely separate parallel network infrastructure, avoiding all of the very likely compromised systems. So it's that as they ran their trials, as they gathered kind of data on how that would work in practice, like we got super interesting data on what's possible, but it's still a choice, right? Do we accept that these devices that have been on a network we know was actively compromised, if we cut out this portion, replace it with a temporary kind of, a Band-Aid network infrastructure piece, is that still okay? And I think you're exactly right. Like we need to ask that question way before, because we need to be able to know, okay, great, we're deploying Crash Cart, and in under an hour, we're going to be back up and running. So, yeah.
So in under an hour, we can now see like certain ransomware attacks occur. And I like to tell people that the most common time for a ransomware attack is Wednesday evening. So like in the time it takes you to have dinner with your family, right? They're going to be an entire attack occurring. But when we look at some of the other types of operations, like your report notices like it highlights a really long precursor window. As we're looking at kind of these hugely varying time windows in advance, where should the dollar spend really be?
I think every team would say, in my team, like incident response was like, I'm the most important team. You shouldn't spend all my money here, right? So I support detection. So I will say detection is where to spend your money. Well, I think it depends, honestly, in every organization and the mission of every organization. And that's also sometimes I try, even when I still be like getting in meetings or getting to this conversation. And I know like sometimes CFO, they don't like us because we take their money, and we always get in this conversation. And I try to make the CFO the one make the decision, not me. Right? I'm not going to tell them like I need the money. I just tell them like, hey, if this goes down, this is how much money we're going to lose. Which one do you want to lose money with? Which risk do you want to take? You tell me, and I'm going to go and execute. And this is going to be between you and the CEO. Don't bring me in. So I think that conversation, it's different between every business organization and what's their objectives and what they try to accomplish. That's where I would go.
I just love how easy these questions are. Yeah, I think it's like asking that question. If the system owners like do not already know the sort of what is the like baseline critical minimum level of functionality? Like, what do we need to be up in the most minimally operationally viable way? Like, that should inform the question. And if you don't know it, answer that question first. Because they may not. Like, it's not always easy to answer.
So we have a few minutes left, and I have questions, but I can also allow others to ask questions. Are there any questions out there?
I don't know who absconded with my wireless mic. So what right now going to have to happen is if you do have a question, I'm going to have to repeat it into the mic up here. Not just because I wanted to crash the panel like Captain Morgan. Questions? I mean, I would have had the question for Cynthia. Well, you mentioned Wednesday. That couldn't have been a coincidence.
Oh, that's true.
And
I mean, Microsoft puts out. Oh, it's my own.
So I was curious, you happened to mention Wednesday. That just couldn't have been random. I mean, the first thought that came to my mind was exploit or patch Tuesday, exploit Wednesday. Was that what you were hinting at?
I'm hinting at data. Like, we can see when, like, I can see when ransomware attacks happen most, like, or attempts happen most frequently. It is Wednesday nights, right? Like, we have a ransomware operations center that like monitors that against our clients. But I think you are correct in why I think there's two reasons, right? You have Patch Tuesday and you have the rapid, and especially nowadays, right, much quicker exploitation of vulnerabilities. But you also want to conduct an attack where there's time in the work week to actually identify that attacks happened. The Friday night's not as useful if you're trying to make money, right? So, like, you know, to think about the actor and like how they're thinking through things.
So Friday night's when they want to cause pain, but then they have to wait till Monday to even start to get payment.
That's right. That's right. So you want people to freak out for like and not want to go in their weekend. So you want to create some time pressure too, so that people want to pay. But it is interesting to think about that collapsing time window, and like things can happen just so rapidly nowadays. And I feel like when I say that, people think AI, and it's not. Like, that's completely like based on Hyper-Vs and just the playbooks that are repeatable time and time again.
Any questions you want me to repeat from the audience? You said you had a question, Cynthia.
Yeah, I do have questions. Should hospitals be allowed to pay, and who should make the call?
I wish Brian were here.
Subtitle: This is not official guidance. You're now free, Andrew.
No, I don't. I'm not a regulator. I have no policy power. I am purely a researcher. I think this goes back to the harm and the like. It would be, I think, extraordinarily cruel and counterproductive if we issued that guidance with no other supplementary support for the HDOs. The targeting is the targeting for the financially motivated ransomware folks is surprisingly good in terms of, like, you know, attacking on Wednesday, ensuring that hospital likely has cash on hand to pay the required ransom that the board can authorize, or like, how many board members does it take to authorize the appropriate payment? And are they all, you know, are any of them on vacation? Like, it's bananas how well targeted some of the sort of ransom kind of requests are. And so I do think that would be, like, that guidance on its own would be a very hard pill to swallow for a while before it made any you know, improvement to the overall situation.
So I'm not gonna answer like where to pay or not to pay, but we did actually a really good exercise in the past where we did similar, like a tabletop exercise, and the last stage was about ransom. And we know that we cannot say pay the ransom or not paying the ransom. We will leave that decision. However, the game or the tabletop exercise was show that you can pay the ransom and win the game, and you still, or can not pay the ransom and still win the game, or opposite. The game is not about paying the ransom or not. The game we were trying to educate our client was about building your security posture of your organization. If you have a strong security posture of your organization, at that stage, you will know what to do.
And to be clear, you know, I think everyone can tell here that I'm a little bit more of a hawk, right, in terms of like what we do against these actors, but I have advised to pay before, right? It was rare. It was because people were going to die. But like those those decisions are really hard. And I think the more we can all do to make sure that decision never happens or has to happen is the right move to make. So thank you for being on our very easy question panel. You guys were great sports and I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.